The search for John George, a 37-year-old father of two from Twinbrook in West Belfast, had begun on a note of uncertainty. When John was first reported missing, no one could have anticipated the long and agonizing journey that his family would face. His disappearance marked the start of a tale of grief, uncertainty, and unwavering resolve. John, also known as John Hardy, had traveled to Spain in early December for what he described as a straightforward holiday. He was supposed to drive from Alicante to Benidorm, a popular tourist destination. The plan seemed simple enough, just a few days of rest. But after a brief conversation with his family on December 14th, in which he mentioned he was still planning to visit Benidorm, John stopped communicating altogether. He was due to return to Belfast on December 18th, but when he failed to check in for his flight, alarms were raised. What had started as a trip to unwind now became a worrying mystery. The George family had no idea where John had gone or why he had stopped responding. Days passed, and the fear grew. As the hours and then days passed without word from John, his family's anxiety intensified. His sudden and complete disappearance was out of character. By December 23rd, when there had been no contact for almost a week, the family began to suspect something more sinister. Courtney George, John's sister, spoke publicly to raise awareness of the situation and to plead for help. They were beginning to fear the worst. The George family launched a GoFundMe campaign in hopes of raising funds to support the search for John. They were desperate for answers, unable to understand why John had gone silent. The situation felt increasingly suspicious. Courtney, while trying to remain optimistic, admitted that each day without contact was making it more difficult to keep up hope. She spoke with the Belfast Telegraph, saying, "Each day without contact makes things harder. We are trying to stay positive, but this is very out of character for him." The family rallied together, making the difficult decision to travel to Spain in the hope of finding some clue as to where John had gone and what had happened. By Christmas Eve, a chilling video surfaced on social media. The video showed John in an apartment, seemingly intoxicated and wearing a baseball cap and a t-shirt. It wasn't much, but it offered the first tangible evidence that John had been alive, at least up until that point. The family was now certain that something was terribly wrong. Spanish authorities took the video seriously. They began investigating the apartment where John had been last seen, believing it might provide some crucial information. However, they also believed that a man living in Spain may hold vital details about John's whereabouts. Despite attempts, this individual could not be located by authorities for questioning, adding to the growing sense of frustration. The video provided more questions than answers, but it at least confirmed that John had been seen recently. For the George family, this small shred of evidence only deepened their fears. Where had John gone after that night, and what had happened to him? By the time the investigation moved into late December, the situation had taken a darker turn. Spanish authorities sealed off the apartment in which John had last been seen, treating it as a crime scene. Two men who had been present during John's stay at the apartment were questioned, but no arrests were made at that time. John's father came to the heartbreaking realization that it was likely his son was dead. "I just don't think he's coming home," he said. His words reflected the growing despair within the family. It was becoming increasingly clear that they weren't just dealing with a missing person case, they were facing the loss of their loved one. Courtney, in an interview with the Sunday Life, also began to voice her fears that John had been murdered and that his body was being hidden. Spanish police began to share their suspicions, confirming that they believed John had been shot dead before Christmas. The investigation had shifted from a missing person case to a suspected murder investigation. The two men questioned by authorities were the prime suspects, but both men were refusing to provide any information on John's whereabouts or the circumstances surrounding his death. The more they resisted, the more suspicious the family became. It was clear that they were hiding something. The family's resolve only hardened as the investigation continued. They refused to return home without knowing what had happened to John. Despite the Spanish authorities urging them to put their efforts on hold, Darren, John's brother, vowed not to leave Spain until they had located his brother's body. Meanwhile, Spanish police were making progress. In late December, they confirmed their suspicion that John had been shot. The two men in question, however, were blaming each other and continuing to withhold information about the location of the body. The family's efforts were supported by the community back home in Belfast, where vigils were held for John. Friends and family members rallied to keep the case in the public eye, organizing emotional appeals and using social media to keep the search going. Despite the overwhelming sense of loss, the family never gave up hope. They continued their tireless search, refusing to accept that John was simply gone without a trace. As the investigation progressed into the new year, new twists emerged. One of the suspects in the case, who had been linked to John's disappearance, skipped Spain and returned to Northern Ireland. What made the situation even more unnerving was that he had traveled on the same flight as John's partner. This development raised more questions about the level of involvement the suspects had in John's disappearance. At the same time, a young woman who had been with John prior to his disappearance came forward, posting a video online in which she denied any involvement in the incident. She stated that she had provided all the information she knew to Spanish authorities, but it did little to calm the growing suspicion surrounding the case. The family was left reeling from the confusion and the continuing lack of answers. As the search expanded and international attention grew, Interpol became involved in the investigation. It became increasingly likely that the suspects were either planning to leave Spain or had already left. The involvement of international agencies was critical as Spanish authorities sought to locate the suspects and determine if they had fled the country. Darren and Courtney continued to push forward with their search, despite mounting frustrations and the lack of concrete leads. Their quest for answers brought them into contact with multiple law enforcement agencies, but still, the mystery of John's death remained unsolved. In early January, the case took a dramatic turn when one of the suspects made a phone call to John's family. The call claimed that John had been shot and left somewhere between Torrevieja and Benidorm. In the recording, the suspect explained that the gun used in the crime had been taken by one of the other suspects and was being cleaned. The call suggested that John had left the apartment on December 14th with another man, but the details of what happened after that remained unclear. Finally, after weeks of searching, Spanish authorities located a body they believed to be John's. This discovery brought both relief and sorrow to the George family. The body had been found, confirming their worst fears, but also bringing them one step closer to understanding what had happened. The discovery ended the search for John, but it did not end the quest for justice. The family was able to identify the body, and they could now turn their attention to what had happened in the weeks prior. Why had John gone missing? Who was responsible for his death? How had everything spiraled out of control so quickly? Despite the discovery of the body, the search for justice continued. The two suspects remained under investigation, but it was still unclear whether they would face charges. The investigation into the circumstances surrounding John's death was ongoing, with Spanish and Northern Irish authorities working together to piece together the final details of the case. The family are resolute. They refused to give up until those responsible for John's death were held accountable. For them, the discovery of the body was just the beginning of the process. They still had to understand what happened to their loved one, and they were determined to find justice for him. For the George family, the journey was far from over. The discovery of John's body brought some closure, but the pain of losing him remained raw. As they continued to search for answers, the family remained committed to ensuring that John's death would not go unpunished. They had traveled far, both physically and emotionally, but their fight for justice would not end until they had the truth. Their journey was one of unimaginable sorrow, but their determination to seek justice for John remained unshaken. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into John George. Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Stay safe out there, and we'll see you on the next video.